Morning, I wanted to take us to the book of Job, and we're going to look there at the account of Job and the things that happened to him a little bit, but we want to focus a little bit on his friend Elihu or Elihu, depending on who you ask. I'm going to say Elihu. You can correct me later if I'm wrong. But when we look at the account of Job, and we understand, and if you're not familiar with the account of Job, I urge you to look into it, read about him. There are many lessons that can be taken from the book of Job. We understand Job being a strong and faithful man, putting up with much adversity in his life. So strong and faithful that the Lord had all confidence in him when Satan wanted to take hold of him, thinking that he could shake his faith. And you could say that maybe he did shake it a little bit, but Job, again, stood strong. He lost his children, his livelihood, his health, really the support of his wife. If you think about it, she said, "Why don't you curse God and die?" With all of the things that were happening to him. Just imagine the life that he lived at that time, and imagine all of the heartache and the trouble. Thankfully so, when we look around us, and most of us in our lives can't imagine the turmoil and the stress and the things that went on in Job's life. We think of storing up treasures in heaven. Matthew 6, starting at verse 19, says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And we can see this in the way that Job conducted himself. Of course, he was upset about all of those things that happened to him and the things that he had lost. But he really did exemplify having that hope after this life, and not having too much tied up in those earthly treasures. One of the other lessons we can take from Job. As we look at the trying times that Job had in his life, we want to, in the end, remember that Job was faithful to the Lord. The trials came. Job's weaknesses were amplified, you could say, but he didn't give up. And as we look through the book of Job, we're going to primarily be talking about chapters 32 through 42, 32 through the end of the book. Feel free to open up there in readiness. But when we think about this friend Elihu that he had, you think about this person Elihu. It actually doesn't tell us that he was his friend, but it does mention three other friends. And I won't attempt to pronounce their names right now, but you can look at them there in the text. He had three other friends that came and talked to him. And maybe you've heard the statement before in life that with friends like that, who needs enemies? And when you look at the things that they told him, the things that they suspected of him, and so on, we understand that they really weren't all that comforting. They really weren't there to be of a help. Whatever was going through their minds, maybe they were trying to be helpful in their own mind. But we understand from the context of the entire story that they could have done and should have done better. And it was not pleasing to God, those things that they had said to Job. But Elihu, he was a little bit different. And he was there in the background. We don't have mention of him until chapter 32. And Elihu, he listened. And as we think about Elihu today, draw your attention back to Matthew 7 and verse 16 that says, "You will recognize them By their fruits are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles. And as we look at Elihu, we can see some fruits being manifested in the way that he conducted himself. We can see fruits manifested in the way that each and every person that we're talking about today, how they conducted themselves. But Elihu listened to understand. If we look at chapter 32 and we read just a little bit. So these three men, these three friends that we mentioned a moment ago, ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. And Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It is not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me, let me also declare my opinion. Behold, I waited for your words. I listened for your wise sayings, while you searched out what to say. I gave you my attention, and behold, there was none among you who refuted Job or answered his words. Beware lest you say, we have found wisdom. God may vanquish him, not a man. As we could read on, and I encourage you to. But as we look at that passage there, we understand that Elihu's anger was kindled because of the things that he heard. He was hearing things, and his understanding of godliness, understanding of God, he saw that God was being shortchanged, I guess you could say. He expected the elder men to understand better than him, there in verses 6 through 10. You know, if you've lived life very long on this earth, you start to look around and you see people and they do foolish things. You know, and all of us have done foolish things. I'm not trying to stand on a pedestal and tell you that I haven't. But as we look around us, we see those that, quite frankly, should be old enough to know better. Maybe we've said that from time to time. I think kind of comically back to a man who was a really good friend of my next door neighbor growing up. And I don't know if it was something in the water or the air around Barberton, Ohio, but my father, myself, the next door neighbor, and several of the neighbor guys, we were car people. And we loved cars. And this man that was a friend of our neighbor, he also did. And he was rather elderly at the time. And in his old age, he bought himself a really fast Buick. And this Buick was supercharged and really, really fast car. And in his age, which I would have expected him to have some wisdom that came with that age, he rolled that car 3 times drag racing people. Over time, it became evident that even though he had some years behind him, that he still hadn't grasped the wisdom of what you should and shouldn't do out on the road. And in like manner, many times as we age and go through life, sometimes we fail to make those understandings of the Scriptures. We fail to take a full grasp of those things that we ought to know. You know, we think back to the Scriptures telling us that by now we should be on solid food. You know, that statement is made in the Scriptures, but you still need the pure milk of the Word. So as we look at Elihu, we understand that he was younger, but he saw some things that needed to be corrected. And he had that urge and that desire to make those corrections. He waited to hear the whole of the matter. In verses 4 and then 11 and 12, we understand that. In verse 11, he says, "Behold, I waited for your words. I listened for your wise sayings. While you searched out what to say, I gave you my attention." There at the beginning of verse 12. So he did something that each and every one of us should do in our lives. We should listen. We should listen to the scriptures. When we approach a situation, maybe with a brother or a sister, we should listen and understand the situation. We should listen and understand where they're coming from in any given situation, so that we might be able to give counsel, so that we might be able to study together and look into the law of the Lord and see what should be done in any given situation. Many times, I think, as human beings, it's just in our nature, it seems, to jump to conclusions and to not be those that listen to understand. But we understand from this reading here that Elihu did something wonderful. He listened. He just waited and he listened. He was patient, even though he knew something had to be said. He didn't jump to conclusions. He was slow to anger, which brings to mind James 1 of verse 19. "You know this, my beloved brothers and sisters, now everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." Or if you're using the King James, slow to wrath. It's very important that we do just these things. You know, we see it laid out for us in the New Testament there in James. We understand that Christ exhibited also, and he still does, exhibit this long-suffering, this patience. And each and every one of us should also have that. You know, again, as we think back to Matthew 7 at verse 16, you know, we can look at these people that are outlined in this account and we can see their fruits. We can look around us and see the fruits of our own lives and the fruits of those around us. And we can understand a little bit about ourselves and others. Elihu knew those three friends and Job by their fruits, just as well as we can look and see his fruits in his statements here in the scriptures. We can also understand that he knew them by their fruits. So Elihu was a good listener. He listened, he waited, he was patient, he waited for the whole of everything to be put out there so that he could take all of the information, put it together, and make as right a decision as he could. And that is something that each and every one of us should take from Elihu and his example. He also warned Job. You know, he listened and he waited for everything to be put out there. He made that decision that a warning needed to be made. And you know, that's what we really want in friends. You know, as brethren, when we look around and we see a path that we each go down, as we watch each other go through our lives, and we see something that is concerning, we should be patient. We should look at each other and the things that we do, and look to the scriptures and be sure that we're on the right track with things, and don't be afraid to warn each other. Don't be afraid to be that support for one another. Elihu did that for Job. He warned him. And if we look at Job chapter 32, starting at verse 16, we read, "Should I wait because they are not speaking, because they have stopped and no longer answer? I too will give my share of answers. I also will tell my opinion, for I am full of words. The spirit within me compels me. Behold, my belly is like unvented wine, like new wineskins. It is about to burst. Let me speak so that I may get relief. Let me open my lips and answer. Let me be partial to no one, nor flatter any man. For I do not know how to flatter. Otherwise, my Maker would quickly take me away. We see some humility in those words. We see the understanding that he could make a mistake as well. Elihu couldn't hold back, though, any longer, as we understand that he uses that descriptive language, and we get that picture of that new wineskin ready to burst. He couldn't hold back any longer. He had listened. He had done his due diligence. He had to say something. And as we walk through our daily lives and we see sin and we see things that are against the will of the Lord, as we study to understand, do we also have that same feeling like you're just going to burst? I've got to do something about this. I have to tell my loved one, my friend. That is something that if we don't have that feeling, then maybe we need to light the fire under us a little bit more. If we don't have that desire to help and to warn others of the perils in their lives. And this, goes through to our neighbors as well. As we see our friends and neighbors around us, as we see the path that perhaps that they're on. Maybe we used to be on that path. Maybe we understand what the end of that path is. Be like Elihu and warn them. Don't hold back. Galatians 6 verse 1 says, "Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you be too tempted." And again, we see that very same mindset being played out in the words of Elihu. There in verse 20, "Let me speak that I may get relief. Let me open my lips and answer. Let me be partial to no one, nor flatter any man." There's still that warning to keep himself in check. He maintained that humility. He maintained that humility in doing so, and understanding that he didn't want to get to the point where he was also speaking in maybe the same way that Job was. Often we prefer that path of least resistance. It's become rather popular in our world today to not ruffle any feathers, to not cause any stir, just let people go on and do their thing. And unfortunately, that desire for that harmony, that desire to not have any conflict and let everything just be puppy dogs and roses, it's become something that has damaged our society. People afraid to tell others about the dangers of their choices. Failure to warn them. We end up having a society that is severely off the course. And if we're not careful, the church also will veer off course. We are surrounded by the world. We are surrounded by those that are choosing that path of least resistance. We know that the path of a Christian is difficult. We know that we're not promised an easy road when we make that decision to be obedient to Christ. When we're raised to walk in that newness of life out of the waters of baptism. If you have any life left in you after that time, you understand that the hard part has just begun. That living rightly before the Lord is the most difficult thing. Revelation 2 verse 10 is, I'll remind you of it later as well, that we must live faithfully until death. That's the hard part. And the path of least resistance isn't going to give us that faithful path, because we're in a world that is not comfortable with godly things. We're in a world where we are the outcast, at least we should be. We need to not prefer that path of least resistance, but understand that path of resistance is what needs to be taken from time to time in our lives. Elihu could have walked away and let things go. He could have taken that path of least resistance and not made any warning. But we need to have friends like Elihu, that will allow themselves to have that discomfort for a moment, so that perhaps they and us can also be stronger in the end. Mankind increasingly avoids that discomfort that comes with rebuking and correction, and it usually is at all costs. And as I mentioned already, it shows. It shows. The cost is often a soul. When we fail to warn others, when we fail to put out that call of warning, the cost is often the soul of our neighbor, our friend, our brother, our sister. We need to also listen. We need to warn others, and we need to understand godliness. And in order to do that, we need to study. We need to understand what the will of the Lord is. Obviously, Elihu must have studied the law of God. He had faith. He understood where God's place was. He rightly states, "For God is greater than man," in Job 33, verse 12. And I venture to guess that each and every one of us knows that God is greater than man. At least we know it in the sense of the knowledge. But to really have that understanding, and to understand that even in our words, we need to put God first. And that's that's where Job was in his discourse. The thing that Elihu was burning over was the fact that he didn't give God his due in that time. He was thinking inwardly about all the things that were going on around him, and it would be difficult, near impossible, for us to be in that situation and not think of these things like Job. But we need to always realize that in the end, no matter what happens, that God is in control, that God is more than man. Again, as we think back to Matthew 7, verse 16, you will recognize them by their fruits. We need to remember that. Look around us and understand what godly things are. Have that understanding. Both Elihu and Job exhibited godly fruits in their lives, unlike the others. When we think of Job's three friends and his wife, they weren't very comforting. You would think that your wife would be the most comforting person in your life. You would hope and desire that. I think back to a time several years ago when our children were small. I'm going to get in trouble for this in a little bit. But when our children were small, they had, the little cars, and sometimes those cars would find themselves to the stairs. And I went downstairs to shut a light off one night, and there was a Hot Wheels car on the stair. And I stepped on it, slipped and fell, and was in a lot of pain. I was laying at the bottom of the stairs in great pain. And Angela came down the stairs and stepped over me and shut the light off without saying, "Are you okay?" And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm going to die. And so I give her trouble about that. She really is a loving, caring wife. She did come to my aid shortly after that. But we hope that our family and those that are close to us are supportive of us in these times of trouble. But that's not always the case. And we need to resort to the Lord, who is always going to be there, to think of those godly things and understand godliness so that we can help our friends and ourselves be on track. Elihu didn't assume the worst in Job. His friends did. His friends assumed, even though, again, we can look back at the fruits of Job's life, and no doubt you could see that he was an upright man. God understood him to be an upright man. Even the devil understood him to be an upright man. But his friends, they assumed the worst because these things were happening to him. His discontent came from Job losing sight of God's omnipotence and omniscience. Elihu realized that Job should understand the all-powerfulness of God, the all-knowingness of God, that in all of these things, that God would be victorious, that his will would ultimately be done, as if the things that we do on this earth can make any difference in the ultimate will of the Lord. Elihu cared enough to warn Job about the way that his thoughts and his mind were beginning to go, understanding that Job was a faithful person, understanding that Job ought to know better and to be focused on the Lord. And oftentimes when we fall into trials and health issues and pains and troubles, a lot of times the last place that we put our mind is on the Lord and on godly things. But it's the first place that we should focus when those things happen. When we look around us again at these things that have happened in our world recently, I'm thankful for the hope of heaven after this life. I'm thankful for the hope of Christ, which quells a lot of the discomfort and the anxiousness and the worry that would otherwise be there in my life. It's a wonderful thing to have that peace that surpasses all understanding. It just doesn't even make sense to those in the world. But Elihu cared enough to warn Job and to kind of try to point his mind back onto that proper course. Sometimes we need that wake-up call. Sometimes we need that attitude adjustment. Someone to just grab our shirt collar and give us a little jiggle and say, you know what? You need to think better. You need to understand who the Lord is. Elihu did that for Job, and then God finished that wake-up call. If you read chapters 38 through 41, we understand that God told him to gird up his loins, told Job to gird up his loins and to be ready to be questioned. And God asked him such questions like, where were you when I did all these things, when I created the universe? And put Job into his place. To put the situation in proper perspective is what Elihu did. And it's something that he needed. It's something that perhaps we need from time to time in our lives. And the prayer is, the hope is that we have friends and family around us that care enough to allow that discomfort to happen so that we might be pointed to the right track. We understand that God spoke to Job and told him, asked him these questions and corrected his course. Well, we understand that now in this dispensation of time, that God speaks to us through his word. He's not going to come down and have a conversation with us in that same way. We rely on our brethren. We rely on our family to help us to be certain to look at our lives, to see our fruits, to put ourselves back on track using the word. When we go through our daily life, we need to look into the word. We need to look into the examples that are given in the Lord's God-breathed word and write our course. We understand that after Elihu talked to Job, after God put him straight, asked him those questions and kind of made him realize God is God and I am not, Job repented of those things. Job repented of the way that his mind was thinking and not putting God first. Job 42, verses 1 through 6, we read, Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no plan is impossible for you. Who is this who conceals advice without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I do not know. Please listen, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard you by the hearing of the ear. But now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract, and I repent, sitting on dust and ashes. Was brought back into a proper perspective, brought back into the proper attitude towards God and his situation. He said, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. We also have heard of God by the hearing of the ear. In fact, that's the first thing that needs to take place in order for us to be in the good graces of the Lord, in order to have any expectation of salvation after this life. We need to hear. You know, after Elihu's discourse, the Lord spoke to Job out of that whirlwind, reminding Job who he is. Job reacts properly, and he repents. You know, and today, I want to remind each and every one of us of who we are. And we want to look inwardly, each and every one of us, and ask ourselves, have we gotten our mind off track? Have we gotten to the place where we've started to let doubts creep in? Where have we gotten to the place where all the things that have happened to us in this past year, the difficult year it's been for our society and really the whole world, have we become like Job? Have we failed to remember that God is able? Have we failed to remember that nothing is impossible for him? And we know that we have that hope of heaven after a while if we've been faithful. He's able to do that. So what do we have to worry about? Now, Job reacted properly and repented. We also need to think about that in our daily lives. Put our trust and confidence in Christ, for he is able. James 4 verse 12 says, there is only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and to destroy. Have you heard the word of the Lord? If you're catching this later on the recording, I ask you to hear the words of the Lord. Look into the word of the Lord, and if you desire that some study, please contact us. We understand that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10:17 tells us that. In much the same way that Job heard the words of not only his friend, but he heard the words of the Lord. And then he changed his ways. We can do that as well. When we hear the words of the Lord and understand what his will is, think about our own lives and realize that I haven't done that. And what do you do from there? When you believe that Christ is who he says he is, then the only next logical step is to do what he said. Repent of your sins and turning away from those things, having a new purpose in your life, renewing that focus on the Lord. And then confessing Christ before men, and then being baptized in the waters of baptism. Being baptized in the waters of baptism because the Lord commanded it. In order for anyone on this earth to be saved, they must follow through with that baptism for the remission of sins. So I ask you today, have you done these things? Have you put on Christ in baptism? It's not too late. The waters are ready. If you've done so, but then you find that maybe you've gone off track a little bit, that you needed that attitude adjustment, that you need to put things back in the proper place, put God first. If you need the prayers of the saints because you haven't remained faithful, there's still breath in your body, it's not too late. You want that crown of life after this life is over. We're here to help. We're here to be a support. If you need the prayers of the saints, and by all means, let us know how we can pray for you. Whatever your need, if you're subject to the invitation, please come forward as we stand and sing. Hear the sweet voice of Jesus.